All right, let's get right into it. So picture this. It's 1975, and a young Australian philosopher named Peter Singer publishes a book that is going to change the world. Now, this wasn't some novel or a dry history book. This was a straight-up work of moral philosophy called Animal Liberation. It basically laid the entire intellectual groundwork for the modern animal rights movement, and in this explainer, we're going to break down the core ideas that set off a global debate. Singer kicks things off with this really powerful, really challenging idea. You see, he's not just talking about being nice to animals. He's framing his entire argument as the next logical step in our moral progress as a species. He's asking us to fundamentally rethink who or what deserves our moral consideration. So, what exactly does he mean by a new liberation movement? Well, for Singer, this whole argument for animal liberation isn't some niche, fringe issue. Not at all. He presents it as the direct, logical next chapter in the long story of our fight against the oppression of other human beings. He asks us to just think about it for a second. Look back at the history of liberation movements for racial minorities, for women. Every single time there was a dominant group that had to be convinced to expand its moral horizons, to actually include the interests of the oppressed. And Singer's big point is that our relationship with animals, it follows the exact same pattern. It's a prejudice built on a totally arbitrary characteristic, what species we belong to. And he gave this prejudice a name. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Singer pinpoints the root of the problem. He argues it's a prejudice so deeply ingrained in us that we barely even notice it. And he builds his entire case around defining this one central concept, speciesism. So what is speciesism? Well, it's the prejudice that says the interests of our own species, us humans, automatically override the greater interests of members of other species. I mean, think about it. Why do we all agree it's wrong to discount someone's interests based on their race or their sex? Singer argues that discounting them based on their species is just as illogical and indefensible. So if it's not intelligence or reason or species, what is the real basis for moral consideration? And this quote just nails it. Singer actually borrowed this crucial question from the 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who was a founder of modern utilitarianism. For a utilitarian, the goal is pretty simple: create the most well-being and the least suffering possible. So the capacity to suffer, that becomes the vital characteristic. That's the one thing that gives a being a right to equal consideration. If a being can feel pain, its pain matters, period. It has to be counted no matter what species it belongs to. And this slide really lays out that powerful analogy at the heart of his argument. Just as racism is prejudice based on race, and sexism is prejudice based on sex, speciesism is prejudice based on species. For Singer, these are all just equally irrational forms of discrimination. So with that philosophical foundation laid, he then turns to the two main areas where this prejudice causes an immense amount of real-world suffering. First, he takes us inside the world of animal experimentation, a practice that, at the time, was almost completely hidden from public view. Just look at that number, 25 million. That's how many animals, we're talking monkeys, dogs, rabbits, rats, were being used in research in the United States every single year when Singer wrote this. And he forced his readers to confront not just the sheer number, but the nature of the suffering involved. The book details some absolutely horrific procedures. The LD50 test, where animals are literally force-fed a substance until 50% of them die. The Dre's eye test, where chemicals are dripped into the eyes of conscious, unanesthetized rabbits. And psychological experiments that would induce learned helplessness in dogs with electric shocks, or create something called wells of despair for monkeys. And here is his central challenge. He says, experimenters reveal their speciesist bias every time they perform an experiment on an animal that they would never consider performing on a human infant with irreversible brain damage. So, if we are unwilling to use a human with a comparable or even lesser mental capacity, then what, other than pure prejudice, justifies using the animal? It's a really tough question to answer. Now, as vast as the suffering in labs was, Singer showed that it was absolutely dwarfed by an even larger system of exploitation: the modern factory farm. That's 10 billion, with a B. That's the number of land animals killed for food in the US each year. Singer argues that for most of these animals, their entire lives, from birth to death, are nothing but suffering. He describes hens crammed into tiny wire cages, unable to even stretch their wings, veal calves kept in cretes so narrow they can't even turn around, and pigs confined on concrete floors in sheds filled with the stench of ammonia. These are not farms in any traditional sense of the word. They are factories for producing flesh and eggs. And what's so essential to understand is that this system isn't an accident. It's the logical result of treating living, feeling beings as mere machines. The goal is to maximize output at the minimum cost. And in that equation, animal welfare is almost completely ignored.
But the book is not just a catalog of horrors. Its title is Animal Liberation, right? And the final section is dedicated to achieving just that.
Singer lays out a clear path for individuals. The first step is to just recognize our own biases. The second, and this is the most important one, is to stop participating. He argues that becoming a vegetarian or vegan is the most direct and powerful way to boycott the products of factory farms and withdraw our support from this system of cruelty. Finally, he calls on us to advocate for a change on our whole society's attitude.
And you know what? The impact was real. Following the book's publication, a whole new generation of activists emerged. They targeted companies like Revlon, leading to the end of animal testing for many cosmetics. They pushed for better conditions on farms, which led to ballot initiatives like California's Proposition 2, and even corporate changes at major fast food chains. The book really did provide the philosophical fuel for a real-world movement. And so, nearly 50 years after it was first published, Singer's final question remains just as powerful as ever. It's a challenge not just to our habits, but to our most basic ideas of justice and compassion. It leaves us to wonder, where do we draw the line of our moral concern, and why?